I want to talk about the ongoing and deeply troubling saga of Lucy Letby for a few minutes, the former neonatal nurse convicted of murdering 7 babies and attempting to murder 7 others at the Countess of Chester Hospital, and the investigations, the arrests, the questions about institutional responsibility that continue to swirl around this case. Letby now serving multiple whole life terms, having gone through 2 trials in which she was found guilty on the basis of expert evidence which itself has been questioned, is now at the centre of one of the most horrifying scandals in the history of the NHS. To overturn one case would be difficult, to overturn 2 would be almost impossible, yet the story hasn't ended with her conviction. If anything, it's exposed an even darker, troubling culture within the health service that anyone who's dealt with the health service will have had some experience of. Documents that seem to be misleading or erroneous or simply full of errors, full of mistakes. Documents that don't seem to be the same as the documents you originally received, and so on. It's a culture that prefers scapegoating to introspection and deflection to truth. Last week, 3 former senior managers at the Countess of Chester Hospital were apparently arrested on suspicion of gross negligence manslaughter. They were not random junior staff, but members of the senior leadership team during the period of 2015 to 2016, precisely when Letby was committing her crimes, allegedly. Their arrests come in the context of 2 overlapping police investigations, one into corporate manslaughter, focusing on systemic failings and decision-making, and the other into gross negligence manslaughter, which addresses the direct actions or inaction of individuals. So rather than exonerate Lucy Letby or point out that there are problems with her case, the NHS and the police have doubled down to arrest more people. Let's throw more people into prison because we've made errors. Police have made it clear that these arrests do not call into question Letby's convictions, but it does underscore that this tragedy was not simply about one rogue individual. It was also about the hospital's leadership culture, a culture that, evidence suggests, ignored, minimised or outright suppressed repeated warnings from clinicians about Letby's presence on the ward or about her errors, which may be simple errors. It may not have been about the intention to murder, which again raises a question about the appropriateness of her sentence and the way she was vilified and dragged through the court by media. This takes us to the ongoing public inquiry, chaired by Lady Justice Thirlwell, which is due to report in 2026. Its brief is to examine how hospital managers responded when frontline doctors raised concerns, because let's remember, multiple consultants documented patterns of baby deaths and collapses, only to be met with threats of referral to the General Medical Council for bullying a nurse. In other words, those who spoke up were silenced. And here we see the true institutional pathology, a tendency to close ranks, punish whistleblowers, and protect reputations at any cost. Even Jeremy Hunt has said that things went wrong during his tenure. The NHS is a treasured institution in this country, and rightly so, but it is not infallible, and when accountability fails, tragedies follow. And the problem is that unless you know exactly what you're doing, you can't raise these issues clearly, because you are deflected and pushed aside at every single level. And the deflection doesn't stop with Lucy Letby, with these three people who apparently have been arrested. The hospital has faced allegations of document tampering. One striking detail is suggested by an entirely different case, with a manager who, with a name remarkably similar to that of Sir David Davis, the MP who ironically has helped spearhead calls for a new review. And this may have been involved in the retrospective doctoring of documents subsequently placed before a court. That allegation is unproven, but its mere existence raises profound questions about honesty in the NHS's internal processes. Meanwhile, Letby herself has maintained her innocence. Her legal team has submitted a detailed dossier to the Criminal Cases Review Commission, and this application contains the views of over 20 experts who argue that the medical evidence used to convict her was flawed. Now, a prisoner who maintains their innocence will never get out of jail, as is demonstrated by Malkinson's extended stay in jail for another crime that he insists he didn't commit. He was eventually proven innocent and he was released, but only after spending significantly more time than his sentence because he refused to accept guilt. This application, the detailed dossier that's been presented to the Criminal Cases Review Commission contains the views of over 20 experts who argue that the medical evidence used to convict Letby was flawed, and the CCRC is now assessing whether to refer her case back to the Court of Appeal, a third court case. The former Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt and the Conservative MP Sir David Davis have both publicly argued for re-examination, citing serious and credible doubts raised by this expert panel. But you've got to remember, Jeremy Hunt was behind so much legislation, particularly against whistleblowers, that is based on flawed processes. Why? Because Jeremy Hunt was advised, presumably, to pursue particular cases to silence the naysayers, to silence people who are criticising the NHS. And the expert review in this case has itself been fiercely contested. Lawyers for the families of the murdered babies have called the report full of analytical holes, dismissing it as little more than a rehash of Letby's defence case. The controversy highlights how complex the medical evidence was at trial, with questions over statistical interpretation, diagnosis of air embolisms, and the reliability of clinical records. The statistics have been questioned themselves by professional statisticians. To complicate matters further, police are also investigating deaths and non-fatal collapses at the Liverpool Women's Hospital, where Letby previously trained, covering cases as far back as 2012. No one yet can say where that inquiry will lead. Ultimately, what emerges from all this is a picture of a health system that, far from being transparent, seems determined to avoid the appearance of error, even at the cost of patient safety. And whether Letby is or is not guilty of the crimes of which she's been convicted, it doesn't make for a safe system, does it? It doesn't give the impression of a system that you can trust. The NHS too often deals with scandal by finding a single scapegoat, issuing solemn statements about lessons learned, and quietly burying the deeper structural failings that enabled disaster in the first place. There's a simple question at the heart of this case. When doctors noticed that babies were dying in clusters on the same nurse's watch, why were they ignored? Was it a matter of fear, of bureaucracy, of professional arrogance, or a combination of all three? The Thirlwell inquiry may provide some answers, though experience teaches us to be sceptical about how deeply public inquiries are willing to dig when the reputations of institutions are at stake, and there is no institution so grand as the NHS. For now, these arrests are a sign that, belatedly, there is some appetite for real accountability, but they are also a stark warning about what happens when organisations forget that their first duty is not to themselves but to the vulnerable people in their care. We owe it to the victims of Lucy Letby and to all patients in the NHS to confront these failings honestly. Now, not with scapegoats or PR apologies, but with a commitment to structural reform and a culture of candour. Anything less would be an insult to those babies who died, to their grieving families, and to the many dedicated doctors and nurses who tried against the odds to stop this tragedy from unfolding. Anything less would be an insult to people, ordinary people, who either are working as nurses or who are having babies and who are worried, who are anxious because of the stories that revolve around this case. Putting somebody in prison does not put this issue to bed. And until we answer these questions, we have a health service which must frighten ordinary people that they can get trapped, and caught up in a situation as ghastly as this. Ordinary people.